Welcome to Radical Feminist Perspectives. This is a women-only webinar, and it's a series of webinars run by radical feminists whose voices have been silenced or cancelled in university, schools, and the media. Frustrated that we can't share what we know in these places, we're offering this online series of webinars here. Today, we're going to hear about the book Shoulder to Shoulder by Midge Mackenzie, and it is being discussed by me, Jo Brew. We were going to have Leah Keith, but her laptop has broken. So what we're going to do today is we're going to look at the book and so hear about the book. I'm going to sort of read through various bits and tell you about the book. And then later on in the year, we'll get Leah to come on and talk about some of the things she really enjoyed in the book, because it is fantastic. So the book it's a documentary. She calls it, Midge Mackenzie calls it a documentary. And she brings together original stories from, and in the original words of suffragettes, British suffragettes. Basically, it is just the UK. And so you can see here, it's quite a big book, like A4 size. It is just below A4 size. And you can see it's a stirring history of the militant suffragettes, voices, the faces, the deeds, the memories, the personal testimony of remarkable women who fought and won the battle for the vote. So here, so this is the intro by Midge Mackenzie. So it says, this stirring history of the militant suffragettes tells of a group of women that rocked the foundations of British society as they waged a blazing campaign to revolutionise the situation of all women. Who were these women? What did they really do, and what was done to them in their passionate struggle against the government? Shoulder to Shoulder presents first-hand testimony of the suffragettes preserved in their memoirs, their speeches, and the magazines they wrote and published, as well as in eyewitness newspaper reports and the debates held by members of Parliament. Each voice, intensely individual and so expressive of personal conflicts and loyalties, tells us something different about what it was like to be a militant revolutionary against the British government. Together, they form a harmony that astonishes and delights with its shared strength and affection, which bound the thousands of women who fought for and won the vote shoulder to shoulder. So already it's it's very pertinent to our current struggle against the transgender identity politics, which is has brought together thousands of women fighting for defending women's rights. And I think, I suppose to me, this seems to be the most similar struggle that that you can really think about, because there was a sort of clear aim and a real sort of mobilization of women. And then the great thing of them actually winning was just wonderful. So let's have a look a little bit more. Now, this is Midge Mackenzie writing, and there's a picture of Countess Markievicz, but the actual words here, most of the time, the pictures go with whoever is doing the writing. But in this case, this is the intro, and it's fantastic in my mind. So this is Midge Mackenzie who wrote it. So she says, I have an abiding interest in history, and most especially in women's history. In March 1968, when I was filming the Golden Jubilee of women's suffrage in London, I became fascinated by the whole story of how the vote was won. Inquiring more deeply into the subject, I discovered this feat had been almost successfully erased from the history books. The women who fought for the vote had vanished from our history. Their writings were long since out of print, and their newspapers buried in archives. As a result, the winning of votes for women is usually erroneously attributed to women's work during the 1914-18 war, with little or no serious reference to the militant campaign that preceded this wartime period. So that's a common experience. I think many of us um, have been told about that the suffragettes got the vote, but really they don't tell the real story. And I think this is a common experience of finding out something else went on. So the Women's Social and Political Union, the WSPU, founded by Emmeline Pankhurst and her daughters Christabel and Sylvia, was the first and largest militant suffrage group in England. Their challenge to the government lasted from 1903 to 1914 and involved not merely speech making and peaceful agitation, but appalling physical hardship, brutality, beatings, forcible feeding, danger, and even death. These events were recorded almost day by day by the suffragettes themselves in diaries, letters, memoirs, speeches, and in the national press, as well as their own magazines, Votes for Women and The Suffragette. The violent struggle throughout the 19th century by succeeding generations of working men to win themselves the vote created the political climate out of which emerged the WSPU. It's important to know that by the late 1880s, when Emmeline Pankhurst was campaigning as a young married woman for the vote, only approximately 4.5 million men in England and Wales, out of a total population of 27.5 million, were empowered to vote. The Women's Social and Political Union represents a most important factor of women's hidden history. The vast majority of us are unaware of the great struggles, achievements, and writings of the feminist movement in the early 20th century. These women of principle and passion were fighting one of the most important and continuing battles for human liberty. Although still being carried on today in the new wave of feminism, as far as most women are concerned, the contest is taking place in a historical vacuum. I feel that the evolution of the totally free woman in our society will be possible only when we repossess the true dignity of our history and reintegrate it into our lives. Only then will we be able to move beyond this particular struggle, instead of being condemned to repeat it with each succeeding generation. The knowledge that my grandmother's contemporaries were not just good wives, mothers, housekeepers, and cooks, but rather a generation of potentially revolutionary freedom fighters gives a new dimension to their lives and a new strength to mine. When I read later accounts of the suffragette movement, I felt that their authors had denied the movement its spirit and soul. They seemed to take a consciously impersonal stand and in no way to reflect the feelings and commitment of the women involved. After a meeting with some of the surviving militants, Grace Rowe, Lillian Lenton, Una Duval, and Alice Paul, and listening to their stories of this great struggle, I resolved to make my own attempt to redress the balance. It was as a documentary filmmaker that I worked on this book, combining, and that actually there is a film which is a 6-part, maybe a 5-part series that has just been rerunning on BBC iPlayer, and it's called Shoulder to Shoulder. So it's the film of this, and it's very, very close. A lot of the words are the exact words. So she made this film, so that's definitely worth looking out for. Not sure if it's still on at the moment, but it will come up again and again. So this film exists. So I worked on this book, combining the original experiences of the suffragettes, as expressed in their own words, with the images that were available to me from the newspapers and magazines of this period, as well as from personal photographs in the archive collections. The text has, of necessity, been edited throughout from the original and condensed, But what is revealed here are the perspectives of the suffragettes themselves, undistorted by my own opinions. Prior to 1914, it was the militant vanguard, the Women's Social and Political Union, that revitalized the question of votes for women with its tactics of political confrontation and the immense publicity that ensued. Though over 1,000 members of the WSPU were imprisoned, they were in fact a tiny minority of the women in England involved in the fight for the vote. Their actions scandalised the more traditional, non-militant suffragist groups, but these same organisations increased their membership dramatically during the WSPU campaign. I do find it necessary to comment on the chapters that deal with the 1914 to 18 war. These are particularly important because they show the gradual disintegration of the suffragette movement as such. The war made the split between Sylvia Pankhurst and the women who were revolutionary socialists, and Emmeline and Christabel Pankhurst, militant Garrett Fawcett, and the conservative feminists, irreparable. As elsewhere, I have tried to report back with the factual chronicles of events as recorded by the women themselves, by the press, and as they appear in the parliamentary annals. So at this stage, I'll just say that the book by Emmeline Pankhurst called something like My Life, her autobiography that she wrote in 1914, just on the outbreak of war, is completely fantastic. I mean, it's just unbelievable. It tells the whole story from Emmeline, who set up the WSPU, from her perspective, and the books and lots of writing by Sylvia Pankhurst, who was this sort of became, once the war had started, much more committed to socialist feminism, and felt that it was very important to include or to focus on working class women and the sort of meld Marxist ideas or socialist ideas with feminist ideas, and went down that path. And then, but her writing is also unbelievably interesting. So I think many of these stories that we're going to hear today, you can go deeper into them and really focus on one of the different suffragettes and see what their perspective was and what they did. And they're just great bits of writing, so worth reading. Okay, this is back to Midge Mackenzie, and you can see there now on this slide, it's April 1975 that this was published, or she wrote this and then it was published shortly after. However, the final granting of the vote in 1918 was restricted to women over 30 who could fulfill certain property requirements. So this is once they got the vote. The reason for this was that women were a majority, and the government was afraid the balance of political power would be seriously affected if, like men, all women over 21 could. 8 million women registered to vote in the first election, and 17 female candidates stood for parliament. The only woman elected was Countess Markievicz in Dublin. A dedicated suffragette, an Irish revolutionary, she refused to take an oath of loyalty to the English crown and thereby forfeited her seat in the House of Commons. By 1928, when all women over 21 had attained their voting rights, the questions of social and political equality that had been raised by the suffragettes were no longer considered important or significant. The new woman, the flapper of the 20s, seemed totally free compared to her Edwardian counterpart, but the superficial permissiveness of society disguised the fundamental lack of progress towards true freedom and equality. The vote had always been thought of by the suffragettes as symbolising only the beginning of wide-ranging changes in the lives of all women. However, achievement of the goal of votes for women, which had once united so many women, remained an empty victory until the new wave of feminism broke through in the 60s. I mean, this is looking back on it, that's a little bit optimistic, isn't it? So she's thinking that the new wave in the 60s and 70s is going to sort of, well, progress and make significant progress a lot further, whereas we're now, after the sort of disintegration of that second wave, or that wave of the 60s and 70s, and then the backlash, and now the massive backlash that we're in, it's quite a different world, but still really, really good to be looking at this book. So I'm just going to have a quick look at the chat and check that nothing. Oh, great. Somebody's put the link to the series. And so we can see, people can see that, and it might not still be up, but if it is, definitely worth a look. Okay, now, so the way that the book is laid out is we've got first-hand testimony from the women, from the suffragettes, and sometimes from male journalists or MPs, seeing what people at the time were saying. And I'm going to show you some of those, some parts of it, but by no means all. So it is really worth it getting the book. It's incredibly inspiring, and it's very brilliant. I mean, it's wonderfully laid out, very easy to read, and so highly recommended. So it starts off with Emmeline Pankhurst, and this is one of her very famous bits of writing. Those men and women are fortunate who are born at a time when a great struggle for human freedom is in progress. It is an added good fortune to have parents who take a personal part in the great movements of their time. I am glad and thankful that this was my case. Excuse me. One of my earliest recollections is of a great bazaar which was held in my native city of Manchester. The object of the bazaar being to raise money to relieve the poverty of the newly emancipated Negro slaves in the United States. My mother took an active part in this effort, and I, as a small child, was entrusted with a lucky bag by means of which I helped to collect money. Young as I was, I could not have been older than 5 years. I knew perfectly well the meaning of the words slavery and emancipation. From infancy, I had been accustomed to hearing pro and con discussions of slavery and the American Civil War. Although the British government finally decided not to recognise the Confederacy, public opinion in England was sharply divided on the questions both of slavery and of secession. So here we can see, and here's Emmeline, in Emmeline Pankhurst's, this is actually taken from her autobiography, those words. We can see that she was involved from a very early age in political struggle, and was not a middle-class white racist concerned only to improve her own position, which is one of the things that is taught, was certainly taught to me, and is part of the dismissive story that schools and the mainstream tell about the suffragettes. So we could see there straight away that she was, her family and herself, they were very aware that struggles were connected. She was, they were not racist, and she was not, and as you read about what Emily Pankhurst living the lives of all women, particularly poorer women in Manchester where she was growing up. So that's, I mean, it's good to have evidence of that and to see that that is who she was. Okay, now we've got Christabel. So Christabel was the daughter who became a lawyer and helped and stuck with her mother and ran the WSPU as throughout the whole time. So Christabel Pankhurst. Good seats were secured for the Free Trade Hall meeting. The question was painted on a banner in large letters. In case it should not be made clear enough, through vocal utterance. How should we word it? Will you give women suffrage? We rejected that form, for the word suffrage suggested to some unlettered or jesting folk the idea of suffering. Let them suffer away. We had heard the taunt. We must find another wording, and we did. It was so obvious, and yet strange to say, quite new. Our banner bore this terse device: Will you give votes for women? Thus was uttered for the first time the famous and victorious battle cry, Votes for Women. And I mean, this book it's just fantastic because over and over again in the book, um, there is we've got the yeah, so over and over again, we've got these stories from women about how they did it. So what they were thinking, and you sort of get to live with them. The moments when they went to a meeting, they came up with the slogans, or they decided to do certain things. Okay, and then here's a one of the many fantastic images in the book. I've sort of read quite a bit about the suffragettes, but saw quite a lot of new wonderful images in this book. They're A4 size, so they're really nice and big, and you get to see. I suppose you get to see the people as well, because you can see in this how joyous these women were, and I think that goes back to the Emmeline Pankhurst saying you know, in a way it's a stroke of luck to be part of one of these big struggles. Um, uh, yeah, it's just good to be involved, and you can see on these women's faces how excited and happy they are, sort of joyous to be part of that. Okay, now Annie Kenney. So Annie Kenney was one of the key suffragettes, and let's hear a bit from her. I remember very little of my life in prison. So yes, and the slogan, "To prison we went." Being my first visit to jail, the newness of the life numbed me. I do remember the plank bed, the skilly, the prison clothes. I also remember going to church and sitting next to Christabel, who looked very coy and pretty in her prison cap. She took my hand tenderly and just held it as though I were a lost child being guided home. She guessed my feelings of strangeness, and no doubt I looked lonely and troubled. I scarcely ate anything at all. Sorry, anything all the time I was in prison. And Christabel told me later that she was glad when she saw the back of me. It worried her to see me looking pale and vacant. None of my family had the faintest idea I was in prison until they read the news in the papers. Two of my sisters paid me a visit and asked if they might pay the fine and give me my release. It was thoughtful of them not to pay it before asking me. I said no, our policy being prison or votes for women. And at the moment, I felt I might be in prison for all my life. The day of my release was a happy and exciting day for me. Members of the choir were waiting to welcome me, two of my girlfriends from the factory, two sisters, and many strangers. A telegram had come from the overlooker at the factory during my absence, demanding my immediate return, but I, of course, had been in prison when it had arrived. Mrs. Pankhurst greeted me by saying, "Annie, as long as I have a home, you must look upon it as yours. You will never have to return to factory life." And reasonably early on, the WSPU got money in order to be able to pay some of the suffragettes, Annie Kenney being one of them. So in order that they didn't have to work and they could work full time on the campaign. So she was one of those who was paid and also given places to stay. Okay, so going back to Christabel, Rise Up Women, this bit. Um, the spirit of the movement was wonderful. It was joyous and grave at the same time. Self seemed to be laid down as the women joined us. Loyalty movement first to the cause and then to those who were leading, and member to member. Courage came next, not simply physical courage, though so much of that was present, but still more the moral courage to endure ridicule and misunderstandings and harsh criticism and ostracism. There was a touch of the impersonal in the movement that made for its strength and dignity. Humour characterised it too, in that our militant women were like the British soldier who knows how to joke and smile amid his fighting and trials. If only the liberal leaders had also been, like the suffragettes, gifted with a sense of humour. Right, next one. So now I don't know, I didn't find a reference to say who that was, but this is a woman being arrested in some of the struggles. Okay, and then this is one of the many great images. This is Jessie Kenny, as she tried to gain admittance to Mr. Asquith's meeting, December the 10th, 1909, disguised as a telegraph boy. One of the great things, I mean, it's so great reading about the suffragettes, is that there was so much activism and so much creativity, and the rules kept on being changed, and the obstacles put in the suffragettes' way were different. That they would go to meetings and they'd be calling out at meetings, and then they had situations quite quickly where women were not allowed to go to political meetings unless accompanied by a man who was looking after them, who would take responsibility for them. So, they were actually banned. And then, so here she's this is probably one of the meetings where individual women or groups of women were not allowed into a political meeting. And good for Jessie here trying to get in. Okay, now, Miss Wallace Dunlop. This is 1909. Taking counsel with no one and acting entirely on her own initiative, sent to the Home Secretary, Mr. Gladstone, as soon as she entered Holloway Prison, an application to be placed in the First Division, as befitted one charged with a political offence. She announced that she would eat no food until this right was conceded. Mr. Gladstone did not reply, but after she had fasted 91 hours, Miss Wallace Dunlop was set free. In an exhausted state, having refused every threat and appeal to induce her to break her fast. So I suppose this is an interesting point, or from my point of view, and I guess everyone's, it's interesting that the movement was very creative and they were developing tactics on the hoof as they were going. And in this case, this is the first fasting. So she acted, taking counsel from no one and acting entirely on her own initiative. This happened over and over again. Women would work out methods or try things out and then do them. And if it worked, other women would get involved. Now, for people who haven't sort of read Emmeline Pankhurst's autobiography, the suffragettes were really quite hierarchical. Emmeline and Christabel were the leaders, and there were a few other people in the leadership, but basically they would give directions to the suffragettes in to do things, or agree. Suffragettes would say, we're thinking of doing the following thing, what do you think? And then they would get directed leadership statements saying yes, do it or not. But in some situations they were not sort of asked or suggested what to do, and this was one of them. And just while I'm on that, there's one of the things that was brilliant about Emmeline Pankhurst was that there were quite often times when women did things that were illegal or militant or extreme, and then she was asked whether she had told them to do it, and she'd said no. She'd often say, no, I didn't tell them to do it, like breaking windows or burning down houses. She'd say, I didn't tell them to do it, but I think I take responsibility for it as the leader, and I think I would have done it myself. So she kept on getting put in prison because she didn't renounce or denounce her organization. So she was, I think she was very, I suppose, supportive of the militancy and and a fantastic role model. So people felt that they would be supported, they wouldn't be turned on by the leadership. Okay, so here's those photos: the hunger striking suffrage prisoners taking exercise in Holloway prison yard. I mean, they look really, it's grim, isn't it? And they're having some exercise. I suppose this is sort of grit and the seriousness of it, that they are, yeah, it matters. And you can see that in their faces. And that's is one of the great things in the book, that you can see um, really get into what it was like and what the women were doing. Um, and I'm just going to sort of butt in again to it, that Gandhi was really, really interested in the suffragettes. So Gandhi, who led the non-violent resistance in India, um, like read about the suffragettes all the time. He wanted to talk to them. He wanted to find out what their tactics were. He um, he could see that what they were doing was creative and revolutionary and could change the world. And one of the many things that's irritating about this erasure of our history and erasure of our political history is you so often hear about Gandhi being the great creator of non-violent resistance and having coming up with all these amazing methods. Nobody, or I've never heard anybody talking about Gandhi saying that he learned so much of it from the suffragettes, or crediting that they had developed so many of these ideas, that they attacked property but not people, and were incredibly careful about not attacking people and using, I suppose it was a violence, they would be violent against property, and then some violence happened to themselves, but they never, they were very, very careful not to be violent against people. And none of that really comes through in history about this genius of their. Yeah, so there's in the chat, did he credit? I think he pretty much never credited them. Um, yeah, and then there's a bit in the chat, the First Division. So they asked to be put in the First Division, which was much better conditions, because they were political prisoners, and that's, you know, the person that is political are actually being oppressed and subjugated as women is politics. Whereas, of course, the British state said it's not, that you're just common criminals. And then, so there was a big battle over that, about where they were put in prison, which they won later on. Okay, now we've got Lady Constance Lytton, and this is in her words, about how she got involved. So, only be thou strong and very courageous, 1909. On this Friday, Christabel Pankhurst and I were on our way to Newcastle. I had made up my mind that I was going to throw a stone. That was as sure as death. But the manner of it was going to be my own. I was equally sure of that. I was not sure of the stone throwers. I had vaguely felt they would have different reasons from mine for this errand, that perhaps, though they could not be more certain than myself, they would mind it less. I had not been in the room with them for 5 minutes before I realized that I was mistaken. I was the hooligan, if there were one amongst them. No particular job was given to me. Miss Emily Davison and I were kept together. It was still early, and first we had to make sure of our stones. We went to the other office to get them. I was doing up mine in brown paper, double thick. You will not be able to throw those, said the organizer. If there is the least bit of wind, and it will get inside and send them you don't know where. That was true. I found some much thinner paper, which kept closely round the stone. I took 4 or 5. On each one, I wrote a different thing. I think they were all taken from Mr. Lloyd George's recent speech. I put them into my pockets and went out. I'd not met Miss Davison before, and it was most interesting to hear her experiences. Still, we could neither of us speak nor listen with anything but effort. We decided to go to see what it was like in the Haymarket, a large open space, where the car with Mr. Lloyd George would probably pass. We heard cheering in the distance. It was the arrival of Mr. Lloyd George at the theatre, he having driven by another way. My companion could not wait any longer, and that somehow or other I must throw my stone. As it would anyhow be but symbolical, it seemed to me one could find an occasion as well here as elsewhere. One thing, however, I was determined upon. It must be more zealously done, more deliberate in its character than the stone throwing at ordinary windows, which had been done lately. I was determined that when they had me in court, my act should inevitably be worse than that of other women. At this moment, there was a hurry in the crowd. The police were making a clearing and opening the carriage entrance for a motor car. We found ourselves on the very edge of the crowd. As the motor appeared, I whispered to Miss Davison, "Is this any good?" "Not the least in the world," was her reply. "Just one of the motors coming back." I knew this, of course, but the instinct was too much for me. To throw a stone against the car as it ran along the side was dangerous, as there were two men in the front. I stepped out into the road and stood straight in front of the car and shouted out, "How can you, who say you back the women's cause, stay on in a government which refuses them the vote and is persecuting them for asking it?" and threw a stone at the car. And then it says, Lady Constance Lytton's stone was aimed low to avoid injuring the chauffeur or passengers. Sir Walter Runciman was in the car, and her stone, wrapped in paper, carried the inscription, "To Lloyd George, rebellion against tyranny is obedience to God, deeds not words." And then we're going to get a nice picture of, here we are, Constance Lytton in Newcastle shortly before throwing a stone at Sir Walter Runciman's car. 1909. And so she's looking pretty determined. And a thing that's interesting to me when I look at the photos of the big meetings and outdoor events is a lot of the time there are loads and loads of men listening to the arguments for suffrage or listening to the actions. Now, sometimes the men were there in order to jeer and dissuade the suffragettes. And they did have lots of horrific moments where they were attacked and beaten up. But there are quite a lot of moments where men were just, I think, just coming along to hear them for interest. And so although the WSPU was a women-only organisation, they had a very a wide audience, and everybody, including loads and loads of men, wanted to know what they were thinking. And then just to say that they did have male supporters, and I think their accountant was a male, but one of their funders who we'll probably get to in a bit. Okay, so here we are now. There's a picture. The pictures of Black Friday, November the 18th, 1910, are not as good as they could be. But this, I think, is possibly one of the best ones. So Black Friday was a time when suffragettes went to protest, and they were attacked by the police, and very brutally, and there was masses of damage done to them. And so it looked as if this was the state deciding that rather than put them in prison, rather than take them to court, that they should just rough them up, or just rough them up. They should rough them up and physically intimidate them and beat them up, and actually then not arrest them. So it was a different strategy. So here again, here's a couple of women being arrested on Black Friday. And this is so a report. So this is by C. Mansell Moulin, Vice President of the Royal College of Surgeons, consulting surgeon to the London Hospital. So I think this is a man writing about what he witnessed after Black Friday. And so it's called Complaints of Roughness in Dealing with Suffragettes. The following letter was received yesterday by the editor of the Daily Mirror. Sir, I notice in your account of the reception given to the deputation from the WSPU to the Prime Minister on Friday last, it is stated that the police behaved with great good temper, tact, and restraint. This may have been the case on previous occasions on which deputations have been sent. On the present one, it is absolutely untrue. The women were treated with the greatest brutality. They were pushed, were almost broken. Their thumbs were forcibly bent back, and they were tortured in other nameless ways that made one feel sick at the sight. I was there myself and saw many of these things done. The photographs that were published in your issue of November the 19th prove it. And I have since seen the fearful bruises showing the marks of the fingers caused by the violence with which these women were treated. Bands of roughs. These things were done by the police. There were, in addition, organised bands of well-dressed roughs who charged backwards and forwards through the deputation like a football team, without any attempt being made to stop them by the police. But they contented themselves with throwing the women down and trampling upon them. As this behaviour on the part of the police is an entirely new departure, it would be interesting to know who issued the instructions that they were to act with such brutality, and who organised the bands of roughs who suddenly sprang up on all sides from nowhere. The Home Secretary, who does not want women arrested, is credited with the statement that he had devised a new method of putting a stop to deputations. Is this the method? The women were discharged without trial by the Secretary of State on the grounds of public policy. Is it public policy that there should be no trial and that the evidence which might otherwise have come out should be suppressed in this way? It's really interesting, isn't it? I mean, I suppose it happened then that the media, I mean, they complain repeatedly that the press were dishonest in uh, reporting what was going on, and then the state were brutal and violent, um, and um, and then denied it. So, but the great thing is having the evidence about it, and it does make you realize it was much more extreme. I mean, the suffragettes were incredibly brave, putting their bodies in the line, being beaten up, um, and it was much more militant than we've been taught to believe. That, or certainly in schools in Britain, my school, I think. I think I probably actually never learnt about the suffragettes at my school, but then later on, when I have when we are told things, we're never told really in detail about this. It's more that there were these selfish white middle class women who just wanted a bit more privilege. It was just really annoying. Okay, here we are. Here's a big demonstration, and you can see here in the middle suffragettes dressed in white walking through London, and then huge crowds coming out to see them. So huge procession. And here it's from prison to citizenship. And this is Emmeline Pethick Lawrence. So her and her husband were very wealthy, and they supported the WSPU most of the time. Right towards the end, as the WSPU became more militant, the Pethick Lawrences left, and but on reasonably good terms. and they were like, sort of really good about it in terms of they didn't want to cause harm to the movement, but they just didn't agree with the militancy that developed sort of 1912 onwards. But anyway, let's see what Emmeline Pethick Lawrence says here. A suffrage procession that broke all records walked through London streets. As I walked amongst the others at the head of the procession, I was able, on reaching our destination, to watch from the upper windows of the Albert Hall precincts the advance of that great army marching five abreast. It was all deeply moving. For me, naturally enough, the most significant and beautiful part of the pageant was the contingent of those who had been in prison. They marched in white, 1,000 strong, each one carrying a small silver pennant, and in their midst was borne a great banner depicting a symbolic woman with a broken chain in her hands and the inscription "From prison to citizenship." And it's so inspiring. And I mean, it does make it's quite a contrast to today, isn't it? That our activism against gender identity ideology has not in any way reached the possibility of us having these great processions. And, I guess it's a different fight and it's a different time. We've got different methods of communication and things work differently, but it does, it is inspiring. It's amazing, isn't it, that these huge, huge demonstrations happened. Okay, now guerrilla militancy. Now, Sylvia, as I guess most of us know, or many of us know, was the socialist feminist, and went on to carry on politically for many years, being a very significant socialist feminist writer, activist, and doing many fantastic things. They had a difference of opinion, I suppose, which carries on today. The Soc Fems and the more radical feminists. I don't know, I guess Emmeline and uh, Christabel wouldn't possibly say they were radical feminists, but they certainly were not socialist feminists. Okay, guerrilla militancy, Sylvia Pankhurst. The brief truce before the withdrawal of the franchise bill and its amendments was followed by a destructive militancy on a hitherto unparalleled scale, petty injuries and annoyances continuing side by side with large-scale damage. Street lamps were broken. Votes for Women was painted on the seats of Hampstead Heath. Keyholes were stopped up with lead pellets. House numbers were painted out. Chairs flung in the Serpentine, cushions of railway carriages slashed, flower beds damaged, golf greens all over the country scraped and burnt with acid. A bowling green was cut in Glasgow, the turf in Duthie Park, Aberdeen. A mother and daughter bearing an ancient name spent much of their time travelling in trains in order to drop pebbles between the sashes of carriage windows, hoping the glass would smash on being raised. Old ladies applied for gun licenses to terrify the authorities. Bogus telephone messages were sent calling up the Army Reserves and Territorials. Telegraph and telephone wires were severed with long handle clippers. Fuse boxes were blown up. Communication between London and Glasgow being cut off for some hours. I think it was 8 hours that they just cut all communication. There was window smashing raid in the West End clubland, the Carlton, the Junior Carlton, the Reform Club, and others being attacked. So yeah, quite a lot of militancy. And this is a joyous photo, isn't it? Votes for Women protest meeting, Holloway Prison. Um, I think many of us, I mean, certainly me, feel some of that joy being involved in a political struggle now, rather than being sort of individually um, trying to make, say, my life or my people around me, the life better, and feeling there's not much you can do about the situation of women in general. And then here, being in this, you can just see they know their rights and they're involved and they're just really happy, and I suppose also thinking they're probably winning. So that's good. Okay, next one. This is about Emily Davison. She died for women. And this is Emmeline, the leader and the sort of older mother figure in the movement. Emily Wilding Davison was a character almost inevitably developed by a struggle such as ours. She was a BA of London University and had taken a first class honours at Oxford in English language and literature. Yet the women's cause made such an appeal to her reason and her sympathies that she put every intellectual and social appeal aside and devoted herself untiringly and fearlessly to the work of the Union. She had suffered many imprisonments and had been forcibly fed and most brutally treated. On one occasion, when she had barricaded her cell against the prison doctors, a hosepipe was turned on her from the window, and she was drenched and all but drowned in the icy water, while workmen were breaking down her cell door. Miss Davison, after this experience, expressed to several of her friends the deep conviction that now, as in days called uncivilized, the conscience of people would only awaken to the sacrifice of a human life. And then this is a picture of her. I mean, there are the pictures of her going, yeah, and as I guess everybody knows, she went out in front of the King's horse at a horse race and was killed or died quite quickly afterwards. So this is her funeral. And look at how many people are there. It was incredibly significant and, tragic. Anyway, that's a photo of her. Now, the rook bee, I don't know how to pronounce this, Venus. This is 1914. So this is just before the Second World War. And this is Mary Richardson, alias Polly Dick. Law and its application reflected public opinion. Values were stressed from the financial point of view and not the human. This is Emmeline Pankhurst very much writes about this as well. I felt I must make my protest from the financial point of view, therefore, as well as letting it be seen as a symbolic act. I had to draw the parallel between the public's indifference to Mrs. Pankhurst's slow destruction, that's with the hunger striking, and the destruction of some financially valuable object. A painting came to my mind. Yes, the Venus Velazquez had painted, hanging in the National Gallery. It was highly prized for its worth in cash. If I could damage it, I reasoned, I could draw my parallel. The fact that I disliked the painting would make it much easier for me to do what was in my mind. And I'll just quickly show you the painting so you can see why she disliked it. I didn't remember. So that's the painting. It's sort of, we have our feminist analysis of it's basically porn and demeaning to women. And so good for her for disliking it and picking that one. And that's interesting, isn't it? That she's making a political point. She wants to say that they value money more than life, and they're happy to see Emmeline on hunger strike rather than give women the votes. But the fact that she actually picked a painting she disliked, which is very much in line with our analysis of porn and the depiction of women having to be naked, and why all of that is. So good for her. So I made my plans carefully and sent a copy of them to Christabel, setting out my reasons for such an action. The days while I waited for her reply seemed endless, but at last the message came, carry out your plan. Now, Christabel by then was in Paris because the offices of the WSPU had been raided and all the leaders were in prison. Christabel had got out in disguise and went to Paris. So that's one of the reasons why it took a long time to get the response back. They thought it was going to be a good idea to keep some of the leadership going. And they did have this sort of quite hierarchical leadership structure. I studied the landscapes and watched the people who were passing. And as I watched them, I felt I would have given anything to have been one of them. I spent an hour like this in utter misery. It was getting near to midday, I knew, chiding myself for having wasted 2 precious hours. I went back to the Venus room. It looked peculiarly empty. There was a ladder lying against one of the walls, left there by some workmen who had been repairing a skylight. I had to pass in front of the detectives who were sitting on the seat, to approach the Velazquez painting. When I was near enough to it, I saw that thick and possibly unbreakable glass had been put over it, no doubt as a protection. As I turned, I saw there was a gallery attendant standing at the far doorway, and there were now 3 I must avoid. I began to sketch again. This time I was a little nearer to my objective. As 12 o'clock struck, one of the detectives rose from the seat and walked out of the room. The second detective, realizing, I suppose, that it was lunchtime and he could relax, sat back, crossed his legs, and opened a newspaper. That presented me with my opportunity, which I was quick to seize. The newspaper held before the man's eyes would hide me for a moment. I dashed up to the painting. My first blow with the axe merely broke the protective glass. But, of course, it did more than that, for the detective rose, with his newspaper still in his hand, and walked round the red plush seat, staring up at the skylight which was being repaired. The sound of the glass breaking had also attracted the attention of the attendant at the door, who, in his frantic efforts to reach me, slipped on the highly polished floor and fell face downward. And so I was given time to get in a further 4 blows with my axe before I was, in turn, attacked. So that's that. And then I think this is the last slide. This is Mrs. Garrard, a well-known suffragette, demonstrating the methods of jujitsu she has taught the WSPU bodyguard. And that, I mean, this is it's brilliant, isn't it? That I I suppose it's remarkable that they're wearing these very feminine or feminizing clothes that are so different from the clothes that we wear today, and that dress, they wanted to look respectable and they wanted to be wearing uh, uh, the correct clothes, and were doing all this militant activism. It's just great. So that's it then. We've come to the end. I think we've got 2 minutes, so I might see if Marion or I'll stop sharing, see if Marion or um, Sheila want to come on for a couple of seconds to add
I'm
something.
happy to do that, Joe. I
Great,
really,
Sheila.
really
Yeah.
enjoyed this. I really enjoyed it because in the 70s, when the women's liberation movement got going, all of this was crucial to us. All of this stuff about the suffragettes was absolutely crucial. I was writing about it. I was a historian. This was our inspiration. There's no question about that. I don't think that so much is known about it now. I think that this interest in the suffragettes has gone off the boil a bit, I reckon. So it was just absolutely lovely to see all those lovely pictures and to hear the quotes. So thank you ever so much for that, Joe. I really enjoyed being reminded. And indeed, as I said in the chat, one of the books that was mentioned, I was in my very first feminist group with those women in Manchester in 73. I mean, this was what was happening. This was what we were into, and this was what women were writing about and doing. And of course, there were splits because the socialist feminists had some heroes. Of course, they had Sylvia Pankhurst. The radical feminists had other heroes, which was Christabel Pankhurst, until she started handing out white ribbons and so on. So yeah, we chose our heroines.
Yeah. Yeah. They're so inspiring. Marion, what about you?
I very recently found out that my grandmother, my mother's stepmother, who was a very, very mean woman, I mean, just, and had a rough life, marched with the suffragettes. And she was never mentioned by name. And there were probably a lot of other women like her. So if you're thinking, I'm not Christabel Pankhurst, I'm not this person, I'm not that person, my mean old grandmother, Grandma Ray, marched with the suffragettes. We are all with the suffragettes. Grandma Ray was with the suffragettes. We are all with the suffragettes. If you want to march with them 100 years later, or be a part of them 100 years later, you can. I mean, we all are, and it had nothing to do with women in these starched dresses. I mean, all I was thinking is like, God, what you could hide under there, an assault rifle or something. I'm not advocating that, but it's like, didn't they think to hide anything under there? These were women. These were my mean old grandmother, but she didn't have to be mean, but these were women just like us, just like all of you listening. You're part of this. We're all part of this.
Yeah. Brilliant. Well, thanks very much. We've got lots of nice feedback in the comments. I think we should really encourage all of us to know the whole of the story and the methods. And to know that, because it's our struggle against the patriarchy, and it's a success story. And the sort of normal revolutionary stories would say, like the Black Jacobins, where they fight against slavery, which was fantastic, or national liberation struggles, or the Russian Revolution, all that Marxist stuff. They're great, but they're not our struggle. They're not, well, they might be part of our struggle, but this is absolutely our female struggle, and I think we should completely know that history. So we'll get. Unfortunately, Leah wasn't able to be here. It's her who loves this book and suggested we do it. So we'll get her on sometime soon and get her to talk more about the book, because there's so much in it, and it will be very interesting to see what she thinks about it as well. Have a nice day, everybody. Bye bye.